If you think the 1950s were all poodle skirts, chrome diners, and lawns trimmed within an inch of their lives, buckle up. Because behind those manicured hedges and pastel kitchens, something a little stranger was going on. Something that quietly changed what Americans grew, ate, and even remembered. While everyone was obsessed with the latest convenience casserole, 20 everyday fruits your great-grandfather grew without a second thought, were quietly erased from backyards, seed catalogs, and family traditions. Some were discouraged, some were banned, some just slipped away because the world changed around them. And by the time anyone noticed, these fruits were gone, like they'd been plucked off the American table by a mysterious hand. Before starting the video, write your location and occupation in comments. Let's dive into the top 20. And trust me, by the end, you'll either want to plant an orchard or file a complaint with history itself. 20. Elderberries. The fruit that got a bad reputation. Overnight picture. This, your great-grandmother stirring a pot of elderberry syrup that could supposedly cure everything from a headache to heartbreak. Elderberries were once a staple in homemade remedies, pies, and jams. Then, the 1950s happened. Suddenly, everyone was terrified of elderberries, not because the berries themselves were dangerous, but because raw elderberries, and their leaves, bark, and seeds, contain compounds that can cause nausea. A few kids ate them straight off the bush, got sick, and boom, panic. Agricultural extension offices practically slapped a warning label across the entire plant. Liability fears, safety-first parenting, and a rising belief that any food needing a special preparation method was too risky. It all added up. So families stopped growing them. Seed catalogs stopped listing them. Knowledge faded. Ironically, properly cooked elderberries are insanely nutritious, immune-boosting, antioxidant-packed, and delicious. But the 1950s didn't want nuance. They wanted it easy. 19. Gooseberries, the berry that threatened the timber industry. You wouldn't think a tiny tart berry could take on America's entire timber industry. But gooseberries did, or at least they were blamed for it. These berries were an alternate host for white pine blister rust, a disease that wreaked havoc on white pine forests that were quite literally money trees in the early 20th century. So the government did something dramatic. They banned gooseberries in many states. Outright. Grow them? Illegal. Sell them? Illegal. Transport them? Also illegal. Entire orchards were ripped out. Families who'd grown gooseberries for generations watched them destroyed. By the 1950s, these once beloved berries were basically wiped off the American map. They never fully recovered. Most people today have never tasted one, which is tragic because gooseberries make some of the best pies and jams you'll ever put in your mouth. 18. Black currants. The berry that became a federal offender. Gooseberries had it rough, but black currants, they were treated like botanical criminals. For decades, the federal government kept a nationwide ban on black currants because they were considered the main host for white pine blister rust. That meant no growing, no selling, no transporting, nothing. Families with old currant bushes were ordered to destroy them or face penalties. Imagine being forced to cut down a plant your grandparents brought from Europe. Heartbreaking. The result? America forgot black currants even existed. Meanwhile, Europe kept them around and used them in everything, from cordials to pastries to cough drops. Today, black currants are slowly making a comeback, but in the 1950s, they were erased with surgical precision. 17. Mulberries, victims of the perfect suburb movement. Mulberries commit one major crime. They drop fruit. That's it. That's the whole case. But in the pristine new suburbs of the 1950s, where driveways, sidewalks, and station wagons had to remain spotless, mulberries became public enemy number one. Cities started banning them. Neighborhoods ripped them out. HOAs pointed and said, "Nope." The fruit wasn't the issue. Mulberries are sweet, abundant, and beloved by kids everywhere. But the 1950s were not about abundance. They were about control, order, a yard you could vacuum if necessary. And mulberries do not cooperate with that vision. 16. Persimmons. When the fruit trolled America. American persimmons are delicious if you wait until they're fully ripe. If you don't, prepare your mouth for a level of astringency that feels like your tongue is folding in on itself. People kept biting into unripe persimmons and assuming they were terrible. They didn't realize that once frost hits and the fruit softens, it transforms into a honey-sweet, caramel-like miracle. As traditional knowledge faded and seasonal eating became abstract, persimmons became that gross fruit no one likes. So people ripped out the trees. It wasn't the fruit's fault, it was bad timing and bad expectations, a combination that ruined many a first impression. 15. Serviceberries, the fruit that got demoted to shrub. Serviceberries, also called Juneberries, had fed people for centuries. Native Americans dried them for travel food. Settlers baked them into pies. Birds loved them. Everyone loved them. Then, nurseries in the 1950s decided, you know what? Let's sell them as ornamental shrubs instead. They marketed them for spring flowers and fall color, and never mentioned the berries. Not once. Homeowners planted them, having no clue they were growing edible fruit. The identity of the plant basically split in half, ornamental versus edible, and the edible side quietly lost the fight. A tragedy, because the berries taste like a blueberry with a hint of almond. Amazing. 14. Pawpaws, too weird for the supermarket era. Pawpaws are America's largest native fruit, and honestly, they taste like a banana met a mango and they started a jazz band together. Creamy, tropical, lush. But they didn't fit the sleek new supermarket system of the 1950s. Short shelf life cannot be shipped long distances, cannot be machine harvested. Ripen unpredictably, so agricultural agents steered farmers and home gardeners toward fruit that behaved more like factory products. Pawpaws didn't get banned, they just got ignored into near obscurity. 13. Beach plums, bulldozed by coastal development. Beach plums grew naturally along the Atlantic coast. They thrived in salty wind, sand, storms, basically anything nature could throw at them. But the 1950s wanted beaches filled with hotels, houses, and promenades. Natural dunes were flattened. Wild stands disappeared. Few thought to cultivate beach plums in gardens. Why bother when you could just plant store-bought varieties? The result, a fruit perfectly suited to the coastline got nearly wiped out, not by disease, but by real estate. 12. Wild grapes, too wild for suburbia. Wild grapes grow where they want. Fence, they'll climb it. Tree, they'll smother it. Neighbors, they'll test their patience. In the tidy new suburbs, that wasn't acceptable. Landscapes had to behave. So homeowners removed wild grapes, and cheap chemical herbicides made the process easy. These grapes had an intense flavor, perfect for juice and jelly. But the 1950s valued neatness over flavor, predictability over passion fruit-like chaos, and wild grapes paid the price. 11. Crab apples, the fruit that became. Just a flower, crab apples didn't disappear. They got reinvented. Once used widely for cider, jelly, and preserves, crab apples were rebranded in the 1950s as purely decorative. Nurseries selected varieties for bloom color, not fruit quality. Some were even bred to be sterile so they wouldn't produce fruit. Because fruit equals mess. and we can't have that near a nice suburban lawn, so the idea of crab apples as food faded away. 10. Chokecherries, feared for their name. Alone chokecherries had fed people for centuries. Indigenous communities used them in pemmican and preserves. They're hardy, reliable, and grow where nothing else will. But the name chokecherry? Yeah, that didn't help their public image. Combine that with pits containing compounds that require proper preparation, and the 1950s decided these berries were too complicated. Why learn? Why experiment? Just buy fruit cocktail in a can instead. Chokecherries dwindled. 9. Huckleberries, overlooked in favor of blueberries. In the 1950s, commercial blueberry production exploded. Money poured into research, marketing, and growing techniques. Huckleberries, which are smaller and wilder, got pushed aside. They didn't grow well on farms. They weren't uniform. They didn't fit the new national flavor profile. Never mind that they taste better than blueberries, or that they thrive in places blueberries refuse to grow. The 1950s didn't care about flavor. They cared about efficiency. 8. Mayhaw, too regional, too unique. Mayhaws grow in swampy areas of the Deep South and make legendary jelly, tart, sweet, and bright. But the 1950s wanted crops that could be grown everywhere, shipped everywhere, and sold everywhere. Regional specialties were viewed as inefficient. Mayhaw trees, with their swampy preferences, didn't make the cut. So they stayed local, and nearly faded from wider memory. 7. Sand cherries, rebranded into oblivion. Sand cherries are tiny powerhouses, drought-tolerant, cold-hardy, and perfect for preserves. But in the 1950s, agricultural agencies decided their best use was for erosion control, not food. So nurseries sold them as landscaping tools, not fruit plants. Home gardeners planted them with no idea they were edible. Over time, people forgot that the fruit even mattered. 6. Autumn olives, victims of their own ambition. Autumn olives were introduced in the 1950s as erosion control plants, and boy did they control erosion. They spread like they had something to prove. Within years, they were invading fields and forests. Wildlife loved the berries so much, they spread them far and wide. By the time people realized the problem, it was too late. States began banning them. The fruit is actually tasty, tart, bright, great for jam. But the plant itself? A little too enthusiastic. 5. Cornelian cherries, too old world for the new American garden. Cornelian cherries had been grown in Europe for centuries. They're nutritious, tart, and ripen at a time when almost nothing else does. But in the 1950s, American tastes shifted hard toward familiar flavors. Anything foreign or old-fashioned got quietly pushed aside in favor of big sweet cherries and mass-market fruit. Cornelian cherries simply didn't fit the vibe. 4. Medlars, the fruit that looks spoiled on purpose. Medlars are one of the strangest fruits ever cultivated, and also one of the most fascinating. You can't eat them until they've softened and started to look like they're on their way out. It's called bledding, and yes, it looks questionable. But once bledded, they taste like spiced applesauce with hints of wine. The 1950s? They were not ready for this level of nuance. They wanted fruit that looked perfect and could be eaten immediately. So medlars, loved for centuries, were deemed too weird for modern America. 3. Quinces, the fruit that needed a pot and sugar. Quinces are magical when cooked, fragrant, golden, floral. But raw? They're basically inedible, hard, tart, and stubborn. People used to turn them into preserves and jellies, but as home canning declined and store-bought jams took over, quince trees lost their place. If a fruit couldn't be eaten fresh, the 1950s had no use for it. Convenience ruled. so quinces faded quietly from yards and memory. 2. American chestnuts, a tragedy, not a trend. Most of the fruits on this list disappeared because of culture or convenience. American chestnuts disappeared because a fungal blight wiped out almost every single tree, around 4 billion of them, by the 1950s. These trees once dominated eastern forests. Their nuts were sweet, abundant, and a major food source for people and wildlife. Entire economies depended on them. And then, they were gone. Nothing else on this list compares to the loss of the American chestnut. It was an ecological heartbreak on a national scale. 1. Barberries, the thorny berry that threatened. Wheat barberries were tart, bright red, and beloved in cooking, especially by European immigrant families, but they hosted wheat stem rust, a fungus that threatened America's wheat supply, and wheat was non-negotiable. So the government launched a massive eradication campaign. Grow barberries? Illegal. Sell them? Illegal. Have one on your property? Agents could destroy it. The ban worked so well that most Americans today have never tasted one. And just like that, a berry that once grew everywhere vanished. The epilogue. A fruitful comeback? These 20 fruits tell a bigger story. How America shifted from diverse, regional, messy, delicious homegrown foods to standardized, polished, supermarket-ready produce. The good news? Many of these forgotten fruits are creeping back into gardens. People are tired of identical store-bought options and want real flavor again. Real history. Real roots. So maybe the story isn't over. Maybe it's just beginning again.